Can you milk a cow? That was the first thing he ever asked her. Not her name, not where she came from, not why a woman with shaking hands and a mended dress had walked 4 miles of dirt road carrying one bag to answer a farmhand ad written in pencil on the back of a feed receipt. Can you milk a cow? She looked him in the eye, and without hesitating, not even for a second, she answered, yes. That was the first lie she told him, and it was the lie that saved them both. The letter had sat on his kitchen table for 2 days. Caleb Dawson was not a man who rushed anything. He ate slowly. He spoke slowly. He made decisions the way a river cuts through rock, not with force but with patience and the understanding that time would handle what urgency could not. 4 letters had come in response to his notice at the general store in Harlow, Texas. The notice read, farmhand wanted, room and board, small pay, hard work. He had written it in pencil and tacked it next to the board where men posted cattle prices and complaints about the weather. 3 of the letters came from men. One was drunk when he wrote it, judging by the handwriting that staggered across the page like a man trying to find a doorway in the dark. Another wanted twice the pay Caleb could offer. The third never showed up. The 4th letter was from a woman. He almost threw it into the stove. He read it instead, standing by the window where the autumn light came through glass so dirty it turned the morning into something sepia and half-remembered. Dear Sir, I am writing in response to your advertisement for ranch work. I am 34 years of age, a widow, and I have experience keeping a household in difficult circumstances. I am not afraid of early mornings or physical work. I have no references, as my previous life did not require them. I can arrive by Tuesday, if you will have me. Respectfully, Eleanor Marsh. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked out at his ranch. 3 cows stood in the pasture like monuments to a better decade. The fence along the south side leaned the way a man leans when he has given up on standing straight. The barn roof had been leaking since June. Caleb had patched it 4 times, and the rain found a new way in every time, as if the sky had a personal grudge against him and the patience to pursue it. His wife had died 3 years ago, a fever that started on a Sunday and finished everything by Wednesday. 3 days. That was all it took to turn a life into a before and after. Since then, the ranch had been sliding, not fast. The kind of slow where you do not notice until one morning you look around and realize you have not fixed anything in a year, and the place looks like it belongs to someone who has already left. He had 2 boys, Thomas, 14, and James, 11. They lived with his brother in town because the ranch was no place for children anymore. That was what he told himself. The truth was harder and closer to the bone. He could not look at them and keep working. They had their mother's eyes. Tuesday came. Caleb had not replied to the letter, but he had not burned it either. At noon, a woman appeared at the end of the dirt road carrying 1 bag. She was thin, not the kind of thin that comes from choice, but the kind that comes from months of deciding between feeding yourself and feeding someone else, and always, without exception, choosing the someone else. Her dress was clean, but had been mended so many times, the original fabric was almost a rumor. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her boots were cracked at the soles, and her hands, which Caleb noticed the moment she set the bag down, were shaking. Mr. Dawson? Yes, I am Eleanor Marsh. I wrote to you about the work. He studied her the way he studied a fence post, before deciding whether it could hold weight. She held still under his gaze, with the kind of practiced patience that only comes from being looked at with doubt so many times it no longer stings. You know anything about ranching? I can learn. Can you milk a cow? Yes. He let the words sit for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the property. She picked up her bag and followed. The tour took 15 minutes because there was not much to tour. The house had 4 rooms, each one holding the memory of better days, like a jar holds air after the flowers have been thrown out. The barn held the 3 cows, a horse named Grit who was older than most of the fences, and enough hay for maybe 6 weeks if the winter decided to be kind, which Texas winters almost never did. The kitchen had a stove that worked, a table that wobbled on one leg, and a pantry that told the story of a man who had stopped planning more than a day ahead. You will sleep in the back room. Breakfast is at 5. I do not have a lot of rules, but I have one. Do not waste anything. There is not enough of anything on this ranch to waste. Eleanor nodded. He left her at the door of the back room. No welcome, no good night. Just the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, walking away. That evening, after the house went dark and Caleb's breathing turned slow and heavy through the wall, Eleanor took the lantern from the kitchen and walked to the barn. She sat down on a low stool next to the biggest of the 3 cows, a brown and white animal with wide, patient eyes that watched Eleanor the way a school teacher watches a student who clearly does not understand the lesson but seems determined to try. Eleanor opened a small book she had bought in town with the last coins she owned, a practical guide to dairy husbandry. The cover was already soft at the corners from how many times she had read the first chapter on the stagecoach. Holding the book in her lap like a prayer she was still memorizing. She read the section on milking 3 times. Then she set the book aside, positioned the bucket beneath the cow, and placed her hands the way the diagram showed. Nothing happened. She adjusted her grip. She squeezed. The cow shifted her weight and looked back over her shoulder with an expression that, if it could be translated into human language, would have been something close to, "That is not it." But I admire the effort. Eleanor tried again. Her fingers cramped. The bucket remained empty and mocking. She repositioned the stool. She reread the paragraph. She placed her hands again. Nothing. She leaned her forehead against the cow's warm side and whispered, "I am sorry. I know this is not pleasant for either of us, but I need you to work with me. I have 2 boys at my sister's house eating food I cannot pay for, and if I fail here, I have nowhere left to go. So I am asking, please." The cow did not answer, but she did not walk away either. Near midnight, a thin stream of milk hit the bottom of the bucket. Not much, barely a cup. It sounded like rain on a tin roof, small and uncertain and beautiful. Eleanor sat back. Her arms were trembling from effort, not fear. Her back ached in places she did not know backs could ache. She looked at the cup of milk and felt something she had not felt in 6 months. Not hope exactly, more like the absence of the certainty that everything was finished. She went to bed at 1 in the morning. She set herself to wake at 4. When Caleb came to the barn at dawn, the cow had already been milked. Not well, not efficiently. The stool had scuff marks on the floor from being moved back and forth, evidence of someone learning through sheer repetition. But the bucket sat on the shelf with a cloth over it. There was enough for breakfast. He looked at the bucket. He looked at the floor. He turned and walked to the house without a word. At breakfast, Eleanor served him eggs, bread, and a glass of milk. "How long have you been milking cows?" Caleb asked, looking at the glass. "Long enough." That was the second lie. But it was the last one she would need. Within a week, Eleanor could milk all 3 cows in under an hour. Within 2, she could do it in 40 minutes with her eyes half shut in the 4 a.m. lantern light. Her hands moving with the kind of unconscious rhythm that only comes from doing something so many times your body takes over and your mind goes somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, where a woman can think about what she is building instead of what she has lost. But milking was not where her real talent lived. Her real talent was seeing what was broken, not the obvious things. Caleb knew the roof leaked and the fences sagged, and the place was held together by habit more than anything structural. What Eleanor saw were the invisible failures, the systems that had never existed, the waste that had become so familiar it was no longer visible. She noticed that the hay was stored in loose piles on the barn floor. Half of it was going damp from the leaking roof and turning moldy before it could be used. She asked one question, "Do you have any spare timber?" He pointed to a pile behind the barn. The next morning he found she had built a raised wooden platform along the dry wall and moved every piece of hay onto it, stacked tight and covered with an old tarp she had pulled from the back room. She noticed the milk was souring within a day because it sat in the kitchen where the stove kept the air warm. She moved it to the root cellar, which ran 10 degrees cooler, and wrapped the jugs in wet cloth. The milk lasted 3 days instead of 1. She noticed that the feed was stored wrong, everything mixed together in one bin, with no attention to which cow needed what. One of the 3 cows was producing half the milk of the others, and Eleanor watched its eating habits for 2 days before adjusting its feed, mixing in wild clover from the creek bank. Within a week, that cow's yield had doubled. She noticed that eggs from the chicken coop were going uncollected because the coop door was broken and Caleb had stopped bothering. She fixed the door with a hinge she fashioned from a strip of leather, and suddenly there were eggs again, a dozen a week where there had been none. None of this came with announcements. None of it came with permission. Caleb would simply wake up and find that something in the world had shifted. A shelf had appeared. A schedule was scratched onto a piece of wood hanging by the barn door, showing milking times and feed amounts. The chicken coop worked again. The cellar had been organized. He did not thank her. He did not comment. But he noticed. And noticing, for a man who had spent 3 years failing to notice that his own life was falling apart, was the highest form of respect he knew how to offer. 3 weeks after Eleanor arrived, a woman appeared at the ranch on a mule. Her name was Ruth Calder. She was in her 60s, built like a fence post that had survived every storm the state of Texas had to offer, and she had been running her own farm 2 miles north since her husband died 20 years earlier. She had heard from the shopkeeper in Harlow that Caleb Dawson had a woman working his ranch now, and she came to investigate because, in her words, any woman fool enough to work for Caleb Dawson deserves at least one friend who will tell her the truth. Ruth looked at Eleanor for a long time. She saw the hunger that was only now starting to fade from the sharpness of her cheekbones. She saw the intelligence in her eyes, carefully wrapped and hidden, the way women learn to hide intelligence in places where it is treated as a threat. She saw the hands, raw, calloused in new places, the hands of someone who had rebuilt herself from the wrists out. You taught yourself to milk. It was not a question. I had a book, Eleanor replied. Ruth laughed, a real laugh, the first one Eleanor had heard since arriving. A book. Lord, come see me Saturday. I will teach you what no book can. Eleanor visited Ruth's farm the following Saturday, and every Saturday after that, for the rest of the autumn and into winter. Ruth taught her butter. Not the rough, grainy, uneven butter Eleanor had been producing, but smooth golden butter, properly churned, with a clean break and a color like September light. Butter that could sell for 15 cents a pound to anyone with taste. Ruth taught her cheese, simple soft cheese first, pressed in cloth, then firmer varieties that held their shape and aged well in a cool space, a mild white cheese that was easy to make in quantity and kept for weeks without turning. Ruth taught her how to read a cow the way a doctor reads a patient, by watching the way it moved, the way it ate, the rhythm of its breathing. She taught her how to predict weather by the behavior of animals. She taught her how to stretch every resource past its natural limit and then stretch it once more. But the most important thing Ruth taught Eleanor had nothing to do with farming. It was a Tuesday in late November. They were sitting in Ruth's kitchen, pressing cheese curds into wooden molds. The room smelled like warm milk and salt and wood smoke. Eleanor's hands were steady and practiced, moving with confidence. But when she spoke, her voice was not. Were you afraid? When your husband died and you had to do everything alone? Ruth did not look up from the cheese. Every single day for the first year. Does it stop? No. You just get louder than the fear. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. A dog barked somewhere on Ruth's property. Then, very softly, in a voice she had not used since the night she sat in the barn with a cow and a book and nothing else. Eleanor spoke. "I was afraid when I walked up that road. I was afraid when he asked me if I could milk a cow, and I lied. I am still afraid most mornings before the sun comes up, and I remember that all of this is real, and all of it could disappear." Ruth set down the cheese mold, wiped her hands on her apron, looked Eleanor in the eye with the steady, unflinching gaze of a woman who had earned every line on her face. "Good. Fear means you are paying attention. The ones who stop being afraid are the ones who lose everything." It was the only time Eleanor admitted to being afraid. She did not need to say it again. Once was enough. Ruth heard it, and that made it real. And making it real was what allowed Eleanor to set it down and keep moving. By December, the milk surplus had outgrown what Caleb could use or sell to neighbors. Eleanor looked at the extra and saw something he did not. She put on the best dress she owned. It was still a mended dress, but clean and pressed, and she wore it like armor. She walked the 4 miles into Harlow, past the general store, past the church, past the blacksmith, straight to the Harlow Hotel on Main Street, a 2-story building that served meals to travelers and cattlemen passing through. She asked to see the manager, a man named Prescott, round-faced and wearing the particular expression of a man who does not take women seriously in matters of commerce and has never once been forced to question this position. "I can supply this hotel with fresh milk and butter, delivered 3 times a week. The milk will arrive cooler and last longer than what you are getting now. The butter is hand-churned, golden, and better than anything within 30 miles of this building. I can begin next Monday." Prescott looked at her the way someone looks at a child who has wandered into the wrong room. "Ma'am, I have an arrangement with Henderson's outfit east of town. Henderson's milk sours before noon in the summer. I have heard guests at this hotel complain about it. I also know his butter has been thin and pale for months because his cows are eating dry feed and nothing else. Mine is better. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to test me. 1 week. If the milk is not fresher and the butter is not finer, you owe me nothing." Prescott named a price. Lower than Henderson's rate, Eleanor named a price. Higher. The number they settled on was fair. Prescott extended his hand. Eleanor shook it. The grip was firm. He noticed. She walked home with a written contract folded inside her apron pocket and did not tell Caleb. She did not tell him the next morning when she woke at 3 instead of 4 to prepare the extra milk and butter for the first delivery. She did not tell him when she borrowed the horse and cart and drove into town. She did not tell him when she returned with coins in her hand and a standing order on paper. He found out the way he found out everything Eleanor did. By noticing. The contract was on the kitchen table on a Thursday evening. Caleb read it once, then again, then a third time, slower. "You went to the hotel?" "Yes." "You signed a delivery contract, using my ranch, my cows." "I used my name, but yes, your cows." His jaw tightened. His hands pressed flat against the table. Something moved across his face that was too complicated for a single word. Anger, certainly. But underneath it, something else. Something closer to bewilderment, the expression of a man who has been drowning so slowly he stopped noticing the water, and someone has just hauled him up by the collar. "You should have asked me. You would have told me no. That is not the point." "Then what is?" Caleb opened his mouth. Nothing came. He looked at the contract again, specifically at the number, the monthly amount the hotel had committed to paying. For 2 years, Caleb had been surviving on what he could sell at market, which barely covered feed and supplies. The contract was worth more than double. He sat down heavily in the chair. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked in the stove. The wind tested the windows. One of the cows lowed in the barn, distant and patient. "How did you know the hotel would agree?" "I did not know. I knew his milk was bad and mine was better. I thought that should be enough." It was. Caleb folded the contract and placed it back on the table, carefully. The way you handle something that has just changed the terms of your life. Next time, tell me first." Eleanor nodded, but they both understood that what he was really saying was, "Next time, I will not say no." January came in like it owned the land and everyone on it. Temperatures dropped so low the water troughs froze solid every night. Eleanor was breaking ice with an axe before dawn, the sound cracking through the dark like gunshots. The cows needed more feed. The house swallowed wood for the stove faster than Caleb could split it. Everything demanded more of something, and there was never quite enough. But Eleanor had prepared for January. She had been setting aside feed since November, small amounts stored on the dry raised platform she had built. She had smoked and salted meat during the fall, so the pantry stayed full when the roads iced over. She had patched every crack and gap in the barn she could find, stuffing them with straw and mud, so the animals stayed warm, even on nights when the wind screamed like something wounded. Caleb watched all of this the way you watch a river change its course, not in a moment, over weeks. And then one morning, you look up and the whole landscape has shifted, and you realize it is never going back to what it was. The hotel contract held through the worst of it. 3 deliveries a week, through snow and frozen mud. Eleanor drove the cart herself. She wrapped the milk jugs in blankets to keep them from freezing. She left at 5 in the morning when the dark was still absolute, and the cold bit through every layer she owned. She never missed a delivery, not once. Not even the Monday in January, when the temperature dropped so far below freezing that the ink in Caleb's pen turned solid on the desk. By February, she had a second contract. A small restaurant near the stockyards wanted butter and the mild white cheese Ruth had taught her. She sold the cheese at 20 cents a pound, and the restaurant ordered 10 pounds a week without haggling. That was the month Caleb mentioned the Guthrie farm. He brought it up at breakfast, casually, the way he delivered all information, as if the words had been sitting in his mouth for days, and he was only now finding a reason to let them out. Guthrie is selling 3 head. His wife wants to move to San Antonio, asking $12 each. Eleanor looked up from her plate. Too much. For those cows it is fair. They are good milkers, healthy. Offer him 10 each for all 3. He wants to leave before spring. He will take it. Caleb looked at her across the table, and something shifted in his expression. Small, a loosening behind the eyes, the faintest fracture in the wall he had built between himself and the possibility that his life could change for the better. You want to buy 3 more cows. I want to build something, Caleb. 3 cows is a chore. 6 cows is a business. He bought the cows the following week, $10 each, just as Eleanor had predicted. Guthrie took the offer within an hour. March broke open like a promise. The creek behind the property swelled with snowmelt. The pasture turned from brown to green in what seemed like days. The 6 cows grazed in the morning light, and Eleanor stood at the fence with her arms resting on the top rail, watching them, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman surveying territory she had earned one frozen morning at a time. She had built a storage shed beside the barn. It was not pretty. It was constructed from reclaimed timber and scrap planks and bore the marks of someone who had taught herself carpentry the same way she taught herself milking, through stubbornness, repetition, and a complete refusal to believe that not knowing how was the same as not being able to. But it was solid. The walls were square. The door swung true. Inside, shelves she had sanded smooth with river stones held jars of milk and rounds of cheese, and the air was cool and clean and smelled like something being done right. On the kitchen wall, a schedule hung from a nail. It covered every task for every day of the week. Milking times, delivery routes, butter days, cheese days, feed schedules and quantities. It was written in Eleanor's small, precise handwriting, and it was the most beautiful document on that ranch because it was proof that someone was thinking about the future. Caleb's boys came to visit in the 3rd week of March. Thomas, 14 now, tall, quiet like his father, arrived first. James, 11, curious and incapable of stillness, followed 3 steps behind. Their uncle dropped them at the gate on a Saturday morning, and they stood in the yard looking at the ranch like travelers who had been given wrong directions. The fence was straight. The barn roof held. The chicken coop was full and functioning. The cows were fat and calm and numerous. Flowers sat in a jar on the porch railing. Wildflowers Eleanor had picked that morning for no reason other than that beauty costs nothing and changes everything. Thomas turned a slow circle. Paw. It looks different. It is. James ran straight for the barn to count the cows. Thomas stood in the yard processing. Eleanor cooked dinner that evening, a roast with potatoes and gravy and fresh bread and butter from the morning churn. James ate 3 full plates and spent the meal studying Eleanor with the intense confusion of a boy trying to understand how a stranger had done what his father could not. He asked who she was 5 different times, phrasing it differently each time, circling the question the way his father circled every difficult truth. Eleanor answered each question with patience and did not try to be their mother. She was something else. Something none of them had a word for yet. A force, a fixed point. The person who had looked at a failing ranch and decided, quietly and without permission, that it would not fail. After dinner, Thomas found his father on the porch. She is the one who did all this. She is. Are you going to ask her to stay? Caleb was quiet. The evening light was the color of warm honey, and it touched everything. The fence, the barn, the shed, the woman inside washing dishes, with the softness of something precious and impermanent. I am thinking about it. 2 weeks after the boys' visit, Eleanor sent for her sons. She had been writing to her sister every week since November. Short letters at first, when she had no money to send. Longer ones later, with coins folded into the paper, and then with real money, dairy money, enough to cover the boys' food and clothes and a little extra for her sister's trouble. By March, the letter said, "It is time. Send them to me." Henry was 8. Samuel was 6. They arrived on the same dirt road Eleanor had walked 7 months earlier, but they did not walk. They came in a cart with a small trunk of clothes Eleanor had purchased with dairy earnings, and they arrived at a ranch that was ready for them. Eleanor had cleared the storage room next to hers, built 2 small beds from pine boards, sewn a curtain for the doorway because she did not yet have a proper door. When Henry saw his mother standing in the yard, he ran. He ran the way only a child can run towards someone they have missed so badly. The missing has become a physical weight, and he threw his arms around her and held on so tight that Eleanor had to kneel to keep from falling. Samuel came slower. He was 6 and careful, and he had learned in the months of separation to be cautious with hope. He walked to his mother and put his hand in hers, small fingers wrapping around calloused ones. Eleanor held them both, her boys. Her reason for saying yes when the answer should have been no. Her reason for sitting in a barn at midnight with a book and a cow and nothing else. Her reason for every frozen morning, every 4 a.m. milking, every contract negotiated and delivery made and shelf built and cheese pressed. And this was where she cried. Not loud, not dramatic. She knelt in the dirt of a ranch that had been dying 7 months ago, and she held her 2 sons, and the tears came the way rain comes after a long drought. Quiet and steady and unstoppable. She had decided long ago that she would cry once and only once, and that it would not be for sadness. It would be for the moment she earned the right to stop being afraid. This was that moment. She wiped her face. She stood. She took one boy in each hand and walked them inside to show them their room, their beds, their new life. April was the month the dairy stopped being a side project and became real. Eleanor registered the business at the county clerk's office. She chose the name herself, Dawson Creek Dairy. When Caleb pointed out that the ranch was his and perhaps his name should be more prominent, Eleanor told him she was naming it after the creek, which belonged to nobody. He looked at her and nearly smiled. The muscles moved. The expression arrived at the border of a smile and stopped there, which for Caleb Dawson was practically a standing ovation. The hotel doubled its order. The restaurant sent a letter requesting twice the cheese. A general store in the next town, Millerton, had heard about the butter through a traveling salesman and wanted a weekly supply. Eleanor hired a boy from Harlow to assist with deliveries 2 days a week, paying him 50 cents a day and a pound of cheese, an arrangement his mother publicly declared to be the finest deal any member of her family had ever negotiated. Ruth came to see the dairy shed in mid-April. She stood inside for a full minute, turning slowly, looking at the shelves and the jars and the cheese rounds and the clean stone floor and the organized, purposeful, unmistakable evidence of a business built from absolutely nothing. She turned to Eleanor. "You built this. You taught me how. I taught you cheese. I taught you butter. This," Ruth gestured at the shed, at the ranch beyond it, at the schedule on the wall and the 6 cows and the 4 boys playing in the yard. "This you built. Do not give that away. Not to me. Not to anyone." Eleanor did not argue. Ruth was right. The knowledge had come from a book and from Saturday mornings with an old woman on a mule. But the building, the construction of a life from the wreckage of another life, the transformation of trembling hands into steady ones, of an empty bucket into a business, of a lie into a truth, that was Eleanor's alone. It was a Sunday evening in late April. The light was doing what Texas light does in spring, taking its time leaving, stretching gold and copper across the sky like it had nowhere to be and no intention of hurrying. The 4 boys were in the yard. Thomas was teaching Henry to throw a rope. James and Samuel were chasing the barn cat, a black and white animal of supreme dignity who tolerated the pursuit with the air of a creature fully aware it was faster than everyone present and simply choosing to let the game continue. The cows were settled. The deliveries had been made for the week. The dairy shed was latched shut for the night, full and orderly and cool. Inside the house, dinner had been eaten and the dishes washed. The schedule on the kitchen wall showed the week ahead, every task plotted, every hour accounted for. Eleanor was on the porch mending a shirt. Caleb was in the chair beside her, the one that creaked when he leaned back. He held a cup of coffee. He had not taken a sip in 10 minutes. Eleanor. She looked up. He almost never used her first name. When he did, it meant he had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally found the words, or the closest things to words that Caleb Dawson was capable of assembling. Summer is going to be busy. The hotel will want more once the cattle drives come through. And the store in Millerton is talking about going weekly. I know. I cannot run this place without you. He paused. The coffee cup did not move. I do not want to run it without you. Eleanor set the shirt down in her lap. Caleb looked at the yard. 4 boys, 2 that had his jaw and 2 that had her eyes, a barn cat pretending to be uncatchable, 6 cows sleeping in a barn with a roof that held, a dairy shed built by a woman who had arrived with nothing and built everything. Can you stay through summer? The question landed in the evening air, the way the first question had landed 7 months ago, plain and direct, carrying more weight than the words themselves could hold. No declaration, no grand speech, just a man asking a woman a question and meaning everything he could not say. Eleanor looked at him. She remembered the first time, standing in the yard with one bag and shaking hands and a lie ready on her tongue. She had answered wrong that day. She had claimed a skill she did not have. And then she had spent 9 months, 3 seasons, 1,000 early mornings and late nights and frozen deliveries and calloused hands, and one hard, earned cry in the dirt with her sons in her arms, making the lie true. She did not need to lie now. I can stay through summer, she answered. Then she paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was the voice of a woman who had rebuilt herself entirely and knew, with the bone-deep certainty that only comes from having done impossible things, that she was not going anywhere. I can stay through anything. Caleb nodded, looked out at the land, his land, her land, their land, the land that had been dying when she arrived and was now, by every measure that mattered, alive. He took a sip of his coffee. Good, because I was not going to ask twice. Eleanor picked up the shirt and went back to mending. Her hands moved the needle through fabric with the steadiness of a woman whose hands had not shaken in months. Not since October. Not since she sat in a barn with a book and a cow and discovered that the distance between knowing nothing and building everything is shorter than anyone thinks, provided you are willing to cross it in the dark. The sun finished its work and left. The boys came inside, noisy and warm, and smelling like grass and dust. The barn cat returned to the barn to resume the private and mysterious life that barn cats lead when no one is watching. The dairy shed stood solid in the dark, full of milk and cheese and the quiet evidence of a woman who answered a question wrong and spent 9 months making it right. In the morning, the work would begin again, milking at 4, butter by 6, deliveries by 9. The steady, relentless rhythm of a life that Eleanor Marsh had not been born to, had not been trained for, had not been given, but had chosen, built, earned, and defended with every ounce of will she possessed. The ranch was still small. The roof still needed attention in places. The fences still leaned where the wind hit hardest. But the cows were milked. The dairy was built. The woman who arrived trembling in autumn was the woman who owned the operation by spring, and no one who had watched her work, not Caleb, not Ruth, not Prescott at the hotel, not even the cow who had patiently endured that first terrible midnight milking, would have bet against her staying through anything. 9 months earlier, a desperate widow had walked up a dirt road with one bag, shaking hands, and a lie. Now she stood on a porch with steady hands, a registered business, 4 boys, 6 cows, 3 contracts, and a man beside her who had just asked her the only question that mattered and received the only answer he needed. She had come with nothing. She had built everything. And she was staying.